He had ridden past that house 1,000 times. He never once looked at the window. Sebastian Vale, 7th Duke of Ashcombe, rode the lane between his own gates and the village of Little Denby every morning of his life that weather permitted. Because his father had ridden it before him and his grandfather before that, and a Duke of Ashcombe inspected his tenant farms at first light, whether or not there was anything in particular to inspect. The lane ran past a low stone cottage with a sagging gate and a single window facing the road, and Sebastian had passed that cottage perhaps 1,000 times in 9 years without once slowing his horse. On a grey morning in October of 1816, his horse threw a shoe 40 yards past the cottage gate, and he was obliged, for the first time in 9 years, to stand still in that particular stretch of lane for 11 minutes while his groom rode back for another mount. That was when he looked at the window. There was a woman in it, seated with her back half to the glass, spooning broth with visible, patient care into the mouth of a man so wasted by illness that Sebastian's first thought was that he was watching the end of something. And his second thought, arriving with the peculiar force of a fact that has been true for years without ever once being noticed, was that he did not know who she was. He asked his steward that evening. Mr. Colquhoun had managed the Ashcombe lands for 11 years and knew every tenant, every rent, every roof-needing thatch, and he answered without needing to consult a book. Miss Louisa Fenwick, Your Grace. Daughter of Dr. Aldous Fenwick, formerly a physician of some reputation in Bath, until a seizure of the brain some 6 years past left him unable to practice, or latterly to walk. She has nursed him alone since. The cottage is held on a life tenancy granted by your late father to Dr. Fenwick in recognition of services rendered. He attended the old Duke through his final illness without fee, I am told, out of respect for the friendship between them. 6 years, Sebastian said. 6 years, Your Grace. She was engaged to be married, I believe, in the year her father was taken ill. The gentleman did not care to wait. Sebastian Vale was 36 years old, and he had inherited a dukedom at 24 from a father he had respected without ever quite loving, and he had spent 12 years since being competent, correct, and entirely alone in the particular way of men who have never once been asked to notice anyone who did not first present themselves as worth noticing. He had a face that women called handsome, and a manner that men called cold, and both descriptions had suited him well enough that he had never troubled to examine either. He thought about the window for 3 days before he did anything about it, which was, for Sebastian Vale, an extraordinary length of time to think about anything at all. He sent, on the 4th day, not himself, but his housekeeper, with a basket of hothouse fruit and a jar of beef tea from his own kitchens, because it seemed the correct and unremarkable thing a landlord did for an ailing tenant, and because he could not yet account, even to himself, for why he wanted to do more than that. Louisa Fenwick received the basket at her own door with plain and startled courtesy, and sent back, by the same housekeeper, a note of thanks so precisely worded, grateful, but neither more nor less than the occasion warranted, that Sebastian read it twice in his study that evening, and found himself, absurdly, disappointed that it contained nothing of the woman herself. He rode past the cottage the next morning at his usual hour, and slowed his horse, deliberately this time, and saw her in the garden gathering the last of the year's lavender into a chipped blue jug, and lifted his hat to her. She straightened, surprised, and dropped a small, correct curtsy, and said nothing at all, because a duke did not customarily stop to be spoken to by a physician's daughter on a public lane, and she had learned, in 6 years of narrowing circumstances, exactly which courtesies were owed and which were not hers to claim. "Miss Fenwick," he said, "I understand my housekeeper called on your father's account." "She did, Your Grace, and we are grateful for it. I am told your father was a friend to mine." "He was, Your Grace. He never once spoke of it as a service requiring repayment, though I believe he considered it one of the great satisfactions of his working life." Sebastian looked at her a moment longer than the exchange strictly required, at the plain grey dress worn soft at the seams, the ink-stained fingers that suggested she kept her own household accounts as well as nursed a dying man, the eyes that met his without any of the fluttering deference he was accustomed to from women of every station. "I should like to call on your father myself," he said, "if it would not distress him. He would be glad of the company, Your Grace, though I ought to warn you he does not always know who is in the room with him, and some days he does not know me." "Then I shall introduce myself as often as necessary," Sebastian said, and it was the first genuinely kind sentence he had spoken to anyone outside his own household in longer than he could readily remember, and he heard himself say it with something close to surprise. He called the following Sunday, and found Dr. Fenwick propped in a chair by the fire, lucid that afternoon. His mind clear, even as his body had failed him entirely, and the old physician spoke for an hour of the friendship between the two dukes, of a fever in the winter of 1798 that he had sat up 3 nights running to break, of a friendship that had outlasted rank because his late Grace, unlike a great many men of title, had never once required Aldous Fenwick to remember his place. Louisa sat throughout, with her mending in her lap, saying little, watching her father's face with the particular attention of a woman who had learned to treasure his good days precisely because she could never predict when the next one would come. Sebastian noticed, watching her, that she never once looked toward him for approval or attention during the whole of the hour, that her entire watchfulness was reserved for her father, and that this, more than anything the housekeeper's basket or the lane had shown him, was the thing that undid the careless assumption he had carried past that window for 9 years. He came again the following week, and on that second visit, with Dr. Fenwick asleep in his chair by the fire, Sebastian found himself alone with Louisa in the small front room for the better part of an hour, and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that conversation with her required none of the careful management he had grown accustomed to in London drawing-rooms. "You do not ask me the things other people ask," she said, folding a stack of linen with the same unhurried economy she brought to everything. "Everyone who calls wants to know how I bear it, or how much longer the physicians give him, or whether I have thought of what comes after. You have not asked me any of that. Would you rather I did? No, I find I am tired of being a subject for other people's sympathy, Your Grace. It is exhausting to be pitied by the hour." She set the linen aside. "You have asked me instead what my father was like before, which is a question that requires me to remember him well rather than mourn him in advance, and I find I am considerably fonder of that question." "Then tell me," Sebastian said. "What was he like before?" she told him, of a physician who had once ridden through the night in a snowstorm to attend a farmer's wife in obstructed labour and refused payment because the family had none to spare. Of a father who had taught her to read a pulse and set a splint by the time she was 12, because he believed a daughter's mind deserved exactly the same education a son's would have. Received of Sunday afternoons before the illness, when he had played the fiddle badly and sung worse and made her laugh until she could not breathe. She talked for the better part of an hour, and Sebastian listened without once glancing at the clock, and it was, he understood afterward, the first time in years he had been in a room with another person and felt no impatience whatsoever for it to end. "You loved him well," he said, when she finally paused. "I love him still. He is not yet gone, Your Grace, whatever the physicians say about the time remaining." Her voice caught, just slightly, on the word remaining, and she mastered it at once, the way he had come to understand she mastered most things, not by refusing to feel them, but by refusing to let the feeling stop the day's necessary work. He came again the week after that, and by November it had become, without either of them naming it so, a settled thing that the Duke of Ashcombe called at the Fenwick cottage on Sunday afternoons. The village noticed, as villages do. Little Denby had watched Louisa Fenwick's life narrow, year by year, from the promising daughter of a respected physician to the unmarried nurse of a dying man, and it watched now, with a mixture of curiosity and the particular cruelty small places reserve for anything that disturbs an established narrative, as a duke's horse stood tied at her gate every Sunday afternoon. It was Mrs. Harmon at the draper's shop, who said, within Louisa's hearing though not quite to her face, that some women knew how to nurse their way into a fortune, and that a dying father made for very convenient bait. Louisa did not answer it. She had learned in 6 years that answering such things only fed them, and she walked home with her basket and her chin level, and did not weep until she was behind her own door, and even then only briefly, because there was broth to make, and a fire to build, and a father to turn in his bed before the evening chill set in. And grief, in her experience, was a luxury that had to wait its turn behind the day's actual necessities. Sebastian heard the same story from his own steward, related with evident distaste for the gossip, and evident concern for what it might mean for the Duke's own reputation, and he rode to the cottage the following Sunday with something new in his chest that he did not yet have a word for, and found her at the gate before he had even dismounted. "You ought not to keep calling, Your Grace," Louisa said, before he could speak. "I have heard what the village says, and I would rather bear it alone than have you made a fool of on my account." "I have heard it too." "Then you understand why I understand that Mrs. Harmon has never once in her life sat up 3 nights running with a fevered man for no fee, and that she is therefore poorly placed to judge what nursing for love looks like, having never once practised it herself." Sebastian's voice had gone quieter and harder in a way she had not heard from him before. "I do not call here because I pity your circumstances, Miss Fenwick, though God knows they would earn pity from a lesser man than I hope to be. I call here because I have ridden past that window for 9 years without once seeing what was in it, and I find I am unwilling to go back to not seeing it." Louisa Fenwick stood very still at her own gate. "That is not a thing you ought to say to me, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, "it is considerably more than propriety allows, and I have said it anyway, and I find I do not regret it, which surprises me more than it perhaps ought to." She did not answer him that afternoon, but she did not send him away either, and he stayed the full hour with her father, and rode home in the last light with something loosened in his chest that had been fastened shut since his own father's funeral 12 years before. It was on a bitter afternoon in the last week of November, with sleet coming down hard against the cottage window and Dr. Fenwick fretful and difficult to settle, that Sebastian found himself helping her lift the old man higher against his pillows, their hands both braced beneath the same thin shoulder, close enough in that narrow bedroom that neither of them could easily step back without seeming to flee. Once the doctor was settled and drowsing again, they stood a moment in the small space between the bed and the window, close enough that Sebastian could see the fine lines of exhaustion at the corners of her eyes, close enough that neither of them moved away. "You are worn through," he said low, and lifted a hand toward her face before he had fully decided to do it, stopping just short of her cheek. his fingers hovering in the space where a touch would have been. "I do not know how you have borne this alone for 6 years." "Because there was no one else to bear it," Louisa said, and her voice was unsteady in a way it rarely was. "You are the first person who has stood in this room and offered to share the weight rather than simply pity me for carrying it." For a long moment neither of them spoke, and neither of them closed the last few inches between them, the sleet ticking against the glass, the old man's breathing slow and even behind them, and then he drew his hand back, deliberately, and stepped away, because the room was too small and the moment too raw, and he would not have either of them regret, in the cold light of morning. A thing done in the exhaustion of a hard evening. "Not like this," he said quietly. "Whatever this becomes, Louisa, I would have it begin on a day that is only ours, not one borrowed from your grief." She looked at him a long moment, something unguarded moving across her face, and did not disagree. Before the trouble came for the Fenwick cottage, and it did. From a direction Louisa had feared for years, and hoped, without much conviction, might never actually arrive. There was one more good month in Little Denby, with a duke calling on Sundays, and a physician who had 2 more lucid afternoons than bad ones. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything. Dr. Aldous Fenwick died in the 2nd week of December, quietly, in his sleep, with Louisa beside him and a fire built high against the winter cold. And the narrator will not pretend it was anything other than what it was, the ending of 6 years of devotion that the world outside that cottage window had never once troubled to properly witness. Sebastian came within the hour of hearing, and found her sitting by the cold hearth she had not yet had the heart to build up again, entirely alone, because there was no one else in Little Denby who had ever considered it their business to sit with her. He did not offer condolences that sounded rehearsed. He built the fire himself, without being asked, and sat with her in silence for a long while. And it was Louisa, eventually, who spoke first. 6 years, she said, and I find I do not know what to do with a morning that does not require broth by 7 o'clock. You do not have to know yet. No, but I will have to know soon, Your Grace, because the life tenancy your father granted, mine dies with him, and I have 3 weeks, I am told, before the cottage reverts to the estate, and nowhere in particular to go. It was the first time either of them had spoken plainly of what came next, and Sebastian understood, with the peculiar clarity that came to him more and more often in her company, that he had been so occupied with the tenderness of watching her grieve that he had not yet properly considered the plain, practical cruelty of what her father's death would cost her beyond grief itself. The second and sharper blow came 4 days later, in the form of Mr. Josiah Fenwick. He was the late doctor's cousin, a solicitor's clerk from Bristol, who had not visited Little Denby in 11 years, and had certainly never once offered assistance during the 6 years of Aldous Fenwick's decline. And he arrived at the cottage on the day of the funeral itself, before the ground was properly closed over the grave, with a document in his hand and an attorney's careful phrasing already prepared. My cousin's affairs were never properly settled, Josiah Fenwick said, standing in the cottage doorway in his good black coat, and as his nearest male relation, I have some claim upon whatever property he possessed at his death. I understand there is a small sum in the bank, and some furniture of value, and I have come to see it properly accounted for before it is scattered or lost. There is very little, Mr. Fenwick, and what there is has been mine to manage these 6 years, and I do not intend to hand it over to a man who did not trouble himself to write so much as a letter of inquiry in all that time. You are an unmarried woman with no legal standing in this matter, Miss Fenwick. whatever your sentimental attachment to the furniture." His voice had the smooth, patient cruelty of a man who had rehearsed the conversation on the coach ride down. "I intend to apply to have myself named administrator of the estate, such as it is, and I expect the court will find in favour of the nearest male relation over a niece with no legal claim whatsoever." "You will find, Mr. Fenwick, that 6 years of care are not so easily dismissed as sentiment," Louisa said, her hand tightening on the door frame. "I kept his accounts. I kept his instruments in good order for the surgeon who now needs them. I know precisely what this house contains and precisely what my father intended for each item in it. And you know nothing at all, because you did not trouble to learn it while there was still time to ask him yourself. Sentiment does not stand up in a court of law, Miss Fenwick." "No," she agreed. "But a written record kept faithfully for 6 years does, and I have one, and I do not believe you do." Louisa closed the door in his face and stood with her back against it for a long moment and understood that she had lost. Within the space of a single week, both her father and, quite possibly, every physical thing that remained of the life she had built around caring for him. Sebastian was, when he heard it, at his own writing desk at Ashcombe, and the narrator will set down plainly what he did that night, because it happened without any witness at all, and was, in its way, the truest measure of the man he had become in the 2 months since he first looked at a window. He sat until nearly dawn drafting and discarding letters, to his own solicitor, to the ecclesiastical court that would have jurisdiction over the small estate, to Josiah Fenwick himself, and burned 3 attempts because each one read, on reflection, as the interference of a man accustomed to solving other people's problems by the simple application of his own rank, which was precisely the kind of help Louisa Fenwick had made plain, months before, that she did not want handed to her like alms. At 4:30 in the morning, by the last of a guttering candle, he wrote the letter that mattered. And it was not to a solicitor at all. It was to Louisa herself, and it said, in 4 careful lines, that he would place at her disposal whatever legal assistance she required, on whatever terms she chose to accept it, and that if she preferred to fight Josiah Fenwick entirely on her own account, he would not interfere, but would stand as a witness to whatever truth the matter required, because 6 years of unwitnessed devotion had gone unwitnessed quite long enough. He rode to the cottage himself at 8 the next morning to deliver it, having slept not at all, and found Louisa already at her own small writing table, with her father's account books spread before her, her eyes red-rimmed, but her hand entirely steady. "I have been thinking all night," she said, before he could speak, "about what 6 years is actually worth, in the language a court will understand, and I find I have kept better records than Josiah Fenwick could possibly imagine a mere niece capable of keeping." She showed him 6 years of household accounts, kept in her own clear hand, every shilling of her father's small income and every farthing of its expenditure on his care, alongside a ledger of a different kind entirely, dates and particulars of every occasion on which Aldous Fenwick, in his more lucid hours, had spoken his wishes aloud regarding his effects, which she had written down, unprompted, at the time. Simply because she had learned that a mind failing by degrees sometimes said its truest things in fragments that deserved to be preserved. He told me, in October, that the furniture from his consulting room in Bath was to go to the parish surgeon who now serves Little Denby, since a physician's instruments ought to go where they will still heal somebody. He told me, in November, on one of his clearest days, that whatever small sum remained in the bank was mine outright, as payment for 6 years of nursing he considered I had more than earned, and he said so in front of the curate, who came to read to him that same afternoon and will swear to it. She looked up at Sebastian. "It is not a will, Your Grace. He was never well enough, in those years, to make a proper one. But it is a record, kept faithfully, and I intend to stand upon it myself, in whatever room Josiah Fenwick chooses to make his claim." Sebastian looked at 6 years of a woman's patient, unwitnessed care laid out in ink on a kitchen table, and understood that he had come to offer rescue to a woman who required, in fact, only an audience. "Then I will stand as your witness," he said, "and nothing more, unless you ask it of me." "Stop apologizing with your eyes, Your Grace," Louisa said, with the first ghost of a smile he had seen from her since her father died. "I am not asking you to fight this for me. I am telling you what I intend to do, and I would be glad of your company while I do it." The hearing, such as it was, took place before the ecclesiastical commissary at Wells in the 3rd week of January, a small and unglamorous proceeding that would have drawn no attention whatsoever had the Duke of Ashcombe not been present in the gallery, which ensured that half the county's gossip found its way to the correct conclusion within the week. Josiah Fenwick argued his claim with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to being believed by virtue of his sex and his profession, describing himself to the commissary as a grieving relation seeking only to see his cousin's affairs properly settled. And for a quarter of an hour it seemed the sheer polish of his phrasing might carry the room regardless of its truth. It was the curate of Little Denby, summoned by Louisa herself, who stood first and swore to the precise words Aldous Fenwick had spoken regarding the bank account in November, delivered in a plain Somerset voice that carried more weight in that room than Josiah Fenwick's practised eloquence ever could. The parish surgeon followed, confirming that Dr. Fenwick had discussed the disposition of his instruments with him directly, in terms that matched Louisa's ledger to the day, and adding, unprompted, that he had called at the cottage a dozen times in 6 years and never once encountered Mr. Fenwick of Bristol crossing that threshold. It was Louisa herself who spoke last. Standing before the commissary with her father's account books in her hands and her voice entirely steady. "Mr. Fenwick did not visit my father once in 11 years, she said. He did not write. He did not send so much as a basket of fruit when the seizures began, nor when they worsened, nor in any of the 6 years I nursed my father alone, unpaid. Because I loved him, and because there was no one else to do it. I do not ask this court to reward me for that devotion. I ask only that it not be handed, as a final indignity, to a man whose sole claim upon my father's memory is a shared surname and a coach fare from Bristol." The commissary found for Louisa Fenwick on every material point, ruling that 6 years of contemporaneous written record, corroborated by 2 independent witnesses, constituted better evidence of the deceased's true wishes than the bare claim of a distant relation who had made no effort to establish any relationship at all in more than a decade. Josiah Fenwick returned to Bristol with nothing, and was not, so far as either Louisa or Sebastian ever heard, spoken of again in Little Denby. Sebastian sat in the gallery through the whole of it, without once speaking, exactly as he had promised, though his presence alone told the commissary and every other soul in that room precisely how the Duke of Ashcombe regarded the matter, which was, Louisa reflected afterward, its own quiet form of testimony, even without a word said aloud. The life tenancy on the cottage reverted to the Ashcombe estate exactly as the original grant had specified, and Sebastian, rather than let it stand empty or turn Louisa out into whatever winter lodging she could find on her own small remaining means, offered her the post of managing the estate's almshouse and infirmary at Little Denby, a genuine position, salaried, requiring precisely the skills 6 years of nursing had given her, and one that Mr. Colquhoun himself had suggested existed as a real vacancy rather than a charitable fiction invented for her benefit. "I will not have you think this is alms dressed as employment," Sebastian said when he offered it. "Colquhoun has needed a competent hand at that infirmary for 2 years and told me so before I ever mentioned your name. You would be doing the estate a genuine service and drawing a genuine wage for it, and if you prefer to decline it and seek a position elsewhere, I will write you the finest character a landlord ever gave a tenant and trouble you no further." Louisa looked at him a long moment. "That," she said, "is the first offer anyone has made me in 6 years that did not require me to be grateful for it." She accepted it and moved into the small rooms above the infirmary that spring, and it was there, on an April evening some months later, with the last of the winter's patients recovered and the first of the year's lambing troubles keeping the village quiet, that Sebastian Vale finally said the thing he had been building toward since a horse threw a shoe on a grey October morning. "I have loved you," he said, "since before I knew your name. Though I did not understand that at the time, I simply knew that a window I had ridden past 1,000 times had suddenly become the only thing in 9 years of that lane worth looking at. I do not offer you rescue, Louisa. You have made plain, at some cost to my pride, that you require none. I offer you a man who has finally learned to see what was in front of him the whole while, and who would like, very much, to spend the rest of his life making certain he never stops." Louisa Fenwick, who had spent 6 years nursing a dying man in a cottage nobody troubled to look into, crossed the small distance of that infirmary room herself, entirely of her own choosing, and kissed him with the whole of 6 years' unwitnessed devotion finally, at last, being witnessed by exactly the person who mattered. They married in the June of 1817, quietly, at the church in Little Denby, with the curate who had testified for her, and the parish surgeon who had received her father's instruments both standing among the guests. And Mrs. Harmon from the draper's shop, who had once called her convenient bait, sent a wedding gift so lavish it was generally understood as an apology, and was accepted as one, because Louisa had never been a woman inclined to nurse a grudge longer than it deserved to live. Sebastian gave the wedding address himself, unusually, standing before the small congregation to say that he had spent 12 years as Duke of Ashcombe, believing that duty and love were separate obligations, one owed to an estate and one reserved, some day, for a wife chosen on paper as carefully as a rent roll, and that a woman spooning broth through a cottage window had taught him, without ever once trying to, that the two were in fact the same obligation, differently addressed. Mr. Colquhoun, who had first named her to Sebastian without ever quite intending to match-make, was heard to remark at the wedding breakfast that he had managed the Ashcombe estate for 11 years, and never once seen his employer laugh as freely as he had in the 6 months since a horse threw a shoe on the Little Denby Lane, and that he intended to leave that particular stretch of road unmended for as long as Providence allowed, on the general principle that a good accident ought not to be improved upon. The infirmary at Little Denby flourished under her management for the following 30 years, first as the Duchess of Ashcombe's particular charge, and later as her own daughters grew old enough to help her run it, as something closer to an institution than a single woman's kindness. On the window-sill of the cottage, where she had once spooned broth into a dying man's mouth, kept standing, at her own request, as a cottage hospital rather than let to a new tenant, there sat, every spring, a chipped blue jug filled with the first lavender of the season, tended now by whichever patient was well enough to cut it. and no one in Little Denby who had lived there long enough to remember ever needed telling why. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived quiet and stayed long enough to change everything, then this story was for you. Out on the lane between Ashcombe and Little Denby, where a duke once rode past a window 1,000 times without seeing it, the love between Sebastian Vale and Louisa Fenwick became the kind that does not need anybody to remember it to be real. Though the whole of that county remembered it anyway, every spring when the lavender came up blue against the glass.